Hello again.
Salut.
Hello.
Well, hello, Molly.
Hello, Neo.
I'm guessing you're here on the back of the top 30 films I previously posted, in which I outlined how I made a list of the greatest ever films by ranking each of the entries in 8 renowned lists. Some which favoured fan-favourite blockbusters like this.
You're gonna need a bigger boat.
And others that highly ranked critically acclaimed art house films like this. So if you've not seen that yet, I suggest you start there first. But if you have, let's jump straight back in with numbers 31 to 60. But first, a quick note. One that I wish I'd been able to put in the previous video.
Daphne can't talk right now. Is it anything urgent?
Firstly, there will be some spoilers. Although most people watching this video will probably already be familiar with most of the films and are simply curious about where they placed, be aware there are spoilers. Secondly, just to clarify, this is not my personal list of greatest films. It was an experiment to see which films were consistently awarded top spots across multiple lists. Like you, there are films that I truly love that didn't make the cut, and there are some here that I actually dislike. That doesn't mean they aren't great, it just means we don't always agree with the consensus. And why should we? We all have slightly different measures of greatness. Especially Ross Fryer. I'm afraid there's still no Pootie Tang on this list.
Say it on me. Bleed.
Finally, I'd also like to quickly plug my Patreon page, where my awesome patrons such as Theo Smith have already had early access to this video. It's a community of film lovers who want to talk about and learn more about film. Now, enough intro, let's get started.
Immediately. Almost immediately.
Rashomon is immediately an intriguing prospect because of its very unique narrative that plays with the concept of the unreliable narrator. In this case, 4 narrators telling different versions of how a man was murdered. It's a narrative device that has been replicated countless times in Hollywood, including the direct remake in the 1964 western The Outrage, and more recently in Ridley Scott's The Last Duel. On the surface, it's a whodunit, but it makes for a more fascinating case study of cinematography as we get to see the same event from 4 angles, literally. It's a classic, and the film that introduced the West to Japanese cinema, breaking box office records for subtitle film at the time. You may remember in the last video I made a sweeping judgment of film fans based on their favourite Christmas movie. Well, I think you can do the same thing based on your favourite Star Wars film. If you say The Phantom Menace, you're probably an expert at wielding all those replica lightsabers you own. If you say The Rise of Skywalker, you probably think Dick Tracy should have beaten The Godfather to the top spot. But if you say The Empire Strikes Back, then you appreciate the much darker tone of the second installment of the original trilogy, and how brave a decision it was following the huge success of Star Wars.
I'm not afraid.
You will be.
Bearing in mind this was a time where sequels rarely lived up to their predecessors, it would have been easy to regurgitate another tale of the underdog rebels triumphing over the Empire. But here, we see the heroes brought to their knees under Irvin Kershner's direction.
If you only knew the power of the dark side.
Empire took all the things that made the first film great and expanded on them, showing us how big this galaxy far, far away really is. New characters and species were introduced with the kind of show don't tell that has spawned countless video games, TV shows and comic books since. It may not have been as revolutionary as the first film in 1977, but most would argue it's a superior film. Time for some French cinema. Sometimes described as a visual poem, this film is light on dialogue and heavy on visual language. Like any other film that explores suppressed emotions, there's a sort of loneliness to the main character Galou, who reflects on his career in the Foreign Legion. A masterful example of understated performance, we see his ambition, jealousy, and discipline play out in stunning scenes like this. And then, in a sequence that is perhaps more famous than the film itself, we see him release all the pent-up emotion in a wild dance that says more about his character than any monologue possibly could have. But it's also the unintrusive, almost curious cinematography of Agnes Goddard that equally captivates, allowing scenes to unfold at their own pace.
Oh, he's a monster. Pure psychopath. So rare to capture one alive. From a research point of view, Lecter is our most prized asset.
There are a great many comments nominating Silence of the Lambs in the previous video. It's not an easy watch, but it's deeply disturbing content owing hugely to Hopkins' performance and the equally unpleasant scenes involving Buffalo Bill that make this such a captivating film. Like the Texas Chainsaw Massacre before it, this film abandons any premise of romanticized violence. It's vulgar here, and the audience feels as repulsed as Jodie Foster in her first meeting with Hannibal Lecter.
Closer, please. Closer.
As you watch it, notice the exhilaration you feel by the end. I don't think the payoff of this film would be nearly as powerful if the villains weren't so completely evil and inhumane. From an analytical point of view, I'd encourage you to take a deep dive into any of the conversations between Lecter and Clarice for a masterclass in directing and verbal sparring.
You still wake up sometimes, don't you? You wake up in the dark and hear the screaming of the lamb.
Saving Private Ryan ushered in a new era of World War II films, having been out of the spotlight for some time before. Its return here was more graphic and realistic than Hollywood had ever dare venture before, and it set the tone for the genre in both film and video games for the next decade. It's a remarkable film from a technical standpoint. For example, the use of 45-degree shutter, which gave a lifelike crispness to action scenes. The 60% desaturated colour that made the footage feel aged, but in recent memory. The consistent low placement of the camera to keep the view at the same hunched perspective as the soldiers, dodging away from bullets. All these things make this one of the most visceral experiences when seen on the big screen. From a storytelling standpoint, this is Spielberg again doing what he does best, creating characters that we quickly align with and invest with until the very end.
The boy's alive. We are going to send somebody to find him. And we are going to get him the hell out of there.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Equally an incredible feat as Orson Welles almost single-handedly producing Citizen Kane at the age of 25, is Victor Fleming's production of two of Hollywood's greatest Golden Age films in the same year, 1939's Gone with the Wind, and here, The Wizard of Oz just a few months before. Oz, perhaps more so than Gone with the Wind, has stood the test of time and has often come to represent the Golden Age as a whole, and it's no surprise. It showcased just how much the medium of film had evolved over the 30 years since Georges Méliès pioneered similar special effects at the start of the century. In fact, I've often thought that had he still been alive, this very easily could have been a Méliès film. The celebration of colour throughout, the elaborate sets that bring fantasy to life.
I am Oz, the great and powerful.
This was a technical masterpiece that you'll know even if you haven't seen it because of how often it's referenced in contemporary culture. Another director who had a habit of releasing back-to-back masterpieces was Alfred Hitchcock. In the year between the previously listed Vertigo and Psycho, he directed North by Northwest, a film mostly remembered for this iconic scene, but is perhaps less known for acting as the blueprint for the first Bond film Dr. No a few years later. The narrative of an advertising executive played by Cary Grant, who is mistaken for a secret agent, is littered with elements that we now consider Bond tropes. exciting set pieces, the Bond girl, heaps of charm from the dashing leading man, and of course, spying. The mere fact that it's a Hitchcock film means there's plenty of rewatch value, as each scene is as meticulously crafted as audiences had already come to expect from the director. Enjoy this one, and don't worry, we'll be seeing more of Hitch before you know it. Since you're watching a video like this, I think it's safe to say that at the very least you've heard of the French New Wave. If that's you, but you've never taken the plunge into perhaps the most significant film movement in cinema history, The 400 Blows would be my joint top recommendation for where to start, along with Cleo from 5 to 7. One of the goals of French New Wave directors, in this case film critic Francois Truffaut, was to create a sense of realism in their films. Notice how rule-breaking techniques such as this stunning long take and this iconic direct address to camera enhance the realism of the scene by reminding the audience of their position as spectator. This movement threw all of the continuity editing rules that Hollywood was establishing out of the window, and here Truffaut uses this to tell a semi-autobiographical story of a boy growing up in Paris that is both personal and accessible to international audiences. 38th on the list doesn't do this film justice. Let's take a welcome stay in Europe now and introduce some Italian realism with The Bicycle Thieves. The realism we've just seen in The 400 Blows perhaps owes some of its techniques to the likes of this film over 10 years its senior. When Hollywood was producing slick, glossy films produced on expensive sets with the world's first A-listers, here we have a story told with untrained actors and shot on location in Rome. The story is one of desperation in the post-war era. Unlike other emotional powerhouse films like Interstellar and The Road, it relies on the relationship between a parent and child in an impossible situation. Historically, this is such a significant film as it couldn't contrast more with the aesthetic found in Italian telefoni bianchi or white telephone films of the era, which were trying to create a sense of grandeur. This film propelled the realist movement far ahead of its time. The Passion of Joan of Arc could very easily have been titled The Close-Up of Joan of Arc, as its representation of the Maid of Orleans is striking in its use of intimate camera work throughout. It's a story that has been told many times before, both on stage and on the big screen, but where adaptations typically focus on her remarkable leadership on the battlefield, this masterpiece focuses on the ordeal of Joan's trial and execution. The performance of Maria Falconetti is widely considered one of the greatest of all time, and the unrelenting extreme close-ups of both Joan and her judges leave the audience feeling as trapped as the leading lady. Perhaps more than any other film, this was the most commented absentee in my previous video. We're wading into the deep end here with what is often cited as David Lynch's masterpiece. The auteur, who often explores aspects of American society, uses Mulholland Drive as a self-described love letter to Los Angeles. Not nostalgically like in The Artist, Singin' in the Rain or The Producers, this film is enigmatic, cryptic, some would say a little bit weird.
No hay banda. There is no band.
But that's what Lynch specialises in, and you can't become serious about film without exploring some of his work first. Mulholland is considered a must-watch because it demonstrates how film form can make the audience question what is real and what is illusion, and how to present these opposites. It's visually striking, and it's completely open to interpretation as Lynch has never offered any explanation for this. Or this. Or this. Watch Mulholland Drive and you'll understand the very hot or cold reaction you'll get when you talk about Lynch to any cinema fan.
Cut it. Thank you very much, Carol. I'm coming back.
I told you he'd be back. Here's Hitchcock's fourth film in the top 60. I've often thought Rear Window could make an excellent stage production, as the film is told almost entirely from the bedroom window of leading man James Stewart, as he observes the goings-on of his neighbours through a lens as he suspects one of them is a murderer. It's often used in the area of film studies devoted to the male gaze, or more specifically, how the cinematic lens takes on the assumed male point of view.
And lots of men don't speak to their wives all day. Lots of wives nag and men hate them and trouble starts. But very, very few of them end up in murder, if that's what you think.
Here is such a gaze, and we see its voyeuristic tendencies more literally than anywhere else in film. In terms of narrative, it's equally fascinating, as we're completely restricted to Stewart's position, and we frustratingly only have the same glimpses and hints of what's going on as he does. I've tried to shy away from letting too much of my own preference for the films on this list show, but I've got to say, I am so glad that Alien has finally made an appearance. There's something about the genre hybridization of horror and science fiction that seems almost natural. Perhaps it's the helpless isolation of deep space, or the unknown of what may be lurking on alien planets. But Ridley Scott's Alien shows better than any other film how terrifying sci-fi horror can be. I rewatched this recently with my film class studying New Hollywood, and I was immediately struck by how amazing it still looks.
That's the line.
It's a great example of where models and sets still look better than some CGI in my opinion. One of the design elements that I love most about this film is Scott's choice to have the alien and human design elements led by completely separate teams. The alien and its world obviously were made immortal by H.R. Giger's iconic design, and the industrial futurist designs of the claustrophobic Nostromo by Ron Cobb and Chris Foss. It's one of those films that you can pause almost anywhere, and the resulting frame is stunning. Here's a deep cut into the world of silent cinema. In fact, it's one of the oldest films on the list. When viewed alongside some of the late 1920s contemporaries, Sunrise stands out as remarkably modern in its camera work, blocking and aesthetic. Here, director F.W. Murnau, perhaps more commonly famed for Nosferatu than Sunrise, brings elements of German expressionism to the big budgets that Hollywood offered to make a still very watchable silent film. What I really love about watching classics like this is that it's very approachable for analysing, as everything is more obvious and in your face, from the performances to the lighting. That's especially true here because of how masterfully it tells a very simple story with very simple elements, foregoing title cards almost entirely by the end. Something Murnau absolutely hated. It's almost like a picture book that becomes universal in its understanding, and it's no wonder this classic won the Best Picture Oscar upon its release. You can even watch it for free on YouTube.
Turn that thing back on!
Come in, Mother Bird. Come in, Mother Bird. Mom has pulled a surprise present from the closet, and he's opening it.
He's really excited about this.
So, at 45, we finally, and quite overdue, come to our first animation. No doubt there will be lots of people who want to have their say about that film being Toy Story instead of Akira or Howl's Moving Castle, but Toy Story completely changed the genre.
Oh, hey, it was nothing.
It's almost ironic that this is reflected in the plot of Toy Story. When it was released as the first feature-length CGI film, there was no doubt that Pixar was ushering in a new age, one that hand-drawn animation would struggle to compete with, just like Woody as he feels replaced by Buzz in the film.
Hey, listen, no one's getting replaced.
Likewise, the humour and more relatable characters were a clear departure from Disney's fairy tales and princesses. It would be fair to call the late 90s and early 2000s the Pixar era of animation, as they followed this up with hit after hit after hit.
How's the lucky Finn?
Lucky.
But it all started with Toy Story. Like several films on this list, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest won all the major Academy Awards in the year of its release. We could easily spend some time talking about the direction that makes the viewer feel as imprisoned as the inmates, with inventive cinematography and set design, But really, the main reason that this film is still revered is the two leading stars. Jack Nicholson as the criminal who pleads insanity for a cushier sentence, and Louise Fletcher as the film's villain, Nurse Ratched. Nicholson's performance is chaotic yet realist, and takes us on a journey ending in surrender, as immortalised in this pivotal scene where we perhaps see him realise the folly of his insanity plan. It's a very moving film that will keep you thinking for days.
Chief, I can't take it no more. I gotta get out of here.
Fellini's first film on the list is La Dolce Vita, a mesmerising film that demonstrates some of his more distinctive filmmaking. For a start, his religious imagery is evident throughout, from the way a character is seemingly anointed in a fountain, to the references to biblical tales throughout.
Shh, behind the church.
Another interesting aspect of this film is the obsession with the number 7. The film is told in roughly 7 episodes set over 7 days and nights, and there's even reference to the 7 deadly sins. It's a great film, but one that I think you'd get the most from by doing a bit of prior research first, something I'd always advise if you're actually studying a film. In this case, there's so much allusion and biblical reference that you'll appreciate much more with a bit of prior reading. Do so and you'll be in for a real treat. We waited 47 films for Fellini, and then we get 2 back to back. This time, it's his 8.5th film. A kind of self-referential joke at the number of films he'd made at the time, and the director's block that he was experiencing at the point of making this picture. And so he did the incredible, drawing inspiration from his uninspiration. The result is a film that blurs the lines of reality and imagination and memory, much in the same way that Mulholland Drive does, and takes the audience inside the mind of a struggling director.
Un film che potesse essere utile un po' a tutti, che aiutasse a seppellire per sempre tutto quello che di morto ci portiamo dentro. A che punto avrò sbagliato strada?
To give just one example, in the opening dream sequence, we see the main character flow out of his car after feeling trapped and suffocated inside it. It's open to so much interpretation, but look close enough and you'll see lots of visual codes that establish the isolation and frustration of a man struggling with his career and relationship. It's no wonder it's often cited as Fellini's masterpiece. Audiences don't usually forget their first encounter with Japanese animated films, and for many, that comes in the form of a Studio Ghibli film. And of those particular people, the film is more than likely Spirited Away, sometimes regarded as the Japanese Alice in Wonderland. The joy of magic portal films like this, and Pan's Labyrinth and Alice in Wonderland, is the sense of discovery you get on an alien world which we share with the teleported protagonist, in this case 10-year-old Chihiro. But for Western audiences, the escapism and discovery is even more alien, as so many conventions and tropes of anime are less well known to us in the West. From the references to Japanese folklore to the uncertainty of the various characters' motivations and alignments, this animation shows director Miyazaki at the height of his influence.
I'm the king of the world!
Don't switch off, I know this one's going to take some justifying, so just hear me out before you comment and disgust. Yes, this is the mother of all 90s blockbusters, but if we consider the different ways of measuring greatness, it's only fair that we also take into account box office success and Academy Awards alongside cultural impact and artistic vision. It won 11 of its 14 Oscar nominations, including Best Film and Best Director. It was the first film to cross the $1 billion mark, and was the highest grossing film of all time until James Cameron beat his own record with Avatar 12 years later.
What? You think a first-class girl can't drink?
Yes, perhaps it's formulaic and the dialogue is James Cameron's typical blend of corn and cheese.
You jump, I jump, remember? I can't turn away without knowing you'll be alright.
But this really was a cultural phenomenon when it was released. Technically, it was meticulously crafted, with a memorable score from James Horner, incredible effects, and very strong performances from DiCaprio and Winslet. Okay, I've said my piece, you can go ahead and comment now.
Can you see the range on that thing?
The The first film in the Apu trilogy introduces us to Apu as a boy living in a small Indian village. Like Belfast more recently, the film depicts an incredibly trying situation for a family from the innocent, rather naive perspective of the child of the family, and the result is an incredibly sentimental, moving film, in spite of death and the family's daily struggles of living in poverty. The production itself could be compared to Apu's naivety. There was no script on day one of the shoot, and almost the entire cast and crew had no previous experience of making a feature film. The film even ran out of funds halfway through production, making it miraculous that it made it to the big screen. It's a landmark film in Indian cinema, and one that I'm sure you'll enjoy. I'm sorry, we need to stop here for a second, because there is no way of explaining how cool this was in 1999. In fact, I'd argue it's just as cool now as it was back then. It absolutely revolutionized science fiction, and its cultural impact is still felt today. I don't think The Matrix could have been made any earlier than this because it needed digital technology to evolve, much like it does in the film, in order to produce incredible effects like this. Until this point, cyberpunk had largely been exclusive to anime, such as Ghost in the Shell, but the Wachowskis dragged it into Western consciousness with its black leather, cyber-mechanical, kung fu aesthetic that was completely new to many audiences. This film invented new techniques like bullet time and captured audiences with its cryptic question in one of the best marketing strategies in all of cinema.
Unfortunately, no one can be told what the Matrix is. You have to see it for yourself.
Raiders of the Lost Ark is the greatest action-adventure film of all time. I truly believe that.
Indiana Jones. Always knew someday you'd come walking back through my door.
Breathing new life into the serials of the 1940s that George Lucas and Spielberg grew up with, like The Adventures of Captain Marvel and Zorro, Raiders perfectly blends action, adventure, Nazis, horror, humor, and romance in a crowd-pleasing blockbuster. It's also one of those examples of flawless casting. It's hard to imagine that Lucas initially wanted Tom Selleck in the lead role, but Harrison Ford, who impressed both Lucas and Spielberg in Star Wars, embodies the role like no one else can, and because of it, Indiana Jones is immortalized. I'll go ahead and say what you're all thinking. How is the first Western on this list all the way down in 54? I know, but hopefully the fact that it's John Ford's masterpiece will take away some of the sting. Released towards the end of the 50s, it marks a sort of turning point between the romanticized depiction of the West that came before it, which reinforced good old American values and heroism, and the darker, more realistic version of the West that emerged in the 60s with the spaghetti westerns of Sergio Leone. We see this darker side of westerns throughout the film, in some of John Wayne's morally dark actions and the harsh reality of survival in the Wild West. And of course, it's John Ford doing what he does best. Here's what Scorsese had to say.
What happens, you go see a Western directed by John Ford, whom by that time I kind of figured out was this terrific director, and John Wayne in it, and by that time I put the two names together when they were both on a film. It was really very interesting for boys particularly. And you sit there and suddenly this character, this lonely character, comes out of the desert or something, and he's absolutely terrifying.
Ain't got no eyes, he can't enter the spirit land. Has to wander forever between the winds. You get it, Reverend. Come on, blanket head.
Speaking of Martin Scorsese, Woody Allen is another prolific director who often used New York City as the muse for many of his films. In Annie Hall, it acts as a backdrop to a very honest reflection on why relationships fail.
Is it the old Groucho Marx joke that I just don't want to belong to any club that would have someone like me for a member?
In this case, his character's previous relationship with Annie Hall, played by his real-world ex, Diane Keaton. This is Woody Allen at his most neurotic and honest in his humour, something that defines much of his storytelling. For me, I would say this is the obvious starting point for anyone new to Woody Allen.
There's an old joke. Two elderly women are at a Catskill Mountain resort, and one of them says, "Boy, the food at this place is really terrible." The other one says, "Yeah, I know, and such small portions." Well, that's essentially how I feel about life.
This 1950 classic is a damning drama that points a spotlight on the toxic world of fame and ruthless ambition in the entertainment industry. Bette Davis stars as an aging Broadway actor who has her career threatened by the younger Anne Baxter waiting to take her place. Rewatching this one, it really struck me how much these themes remain relevant today, with a whole generation of people desperately seeking fame online or in the big city, only to find a horde of younger, more talented people waiting in the wings.
As a matter of fact, you're looking at it. The remains of Margot Channing.
It's a very well written film that has stood the test of time.
A premeditated murder is the most serious charge tried in our criminal courts. You've listened to the testimony. You've had the law read to you and interpreted as it applies in this case. It's now your duty to sit down and try and separate the facts from the fancy.
When you think of courtroom dramas, the first films that probably come to mind are To Kill a Mockingbird or A Few Good Men, but this 1957 classic is the most gripping you'll find. It tells the story of a group of jurors who have to decide on the fate of a teenager charged with murder. That's the whole film, 12 angry men deliberating.
I think it's customary to take a preliminary vote.
Yeah, let's vote. Who knows, maybe we can all get out of here, huh?
It's a fascinating study of cinematography as the hot claustrophobic setting doesn't change. Unlike other films that have had to grapple with challenging sets like submarine films or prison dramas, the lack of space is used to the advantage of the narrative here. Note how the high-up wide shots become more close-up and position us in the middle of the debate as the audience gets pulled in. It's highly regarded by both Screen Rant appearing at number 2 and audiences alike taking the number 5 spot in IMDb's user score.
I gave you my arguments. We're not convinced. We want to hear them again. We have as much time as it takes.
E.T. plays with the narrative device of introducing an incredible creature that helps heal the wounds of a suffering child. We see it replicated in A Monster Calls, My Neighbor Totoro, Big Hero 6, the list goes on, but I would argue that it's never been done better than in Spielberg's 1982 classic.
E.T. phone home.
For Spielberg, the film is semi-autobiographical, and just like E.T. healing Elliot's wounds, making this film was cathartic for the director. The parallels between the two is clear: the separation of their parents, the suburban setting that mirrored Spielberg's own. But most of all, it's each of their escapes into imagination that captivates the audience. Spielberg with his love of cinema, and Elliot in the extraterrestrial best friend.
Permettez, Général, je vous l'enlève.
Vous nous le rendrez?
Oh, soyez tranquille.
Ah.
Yes, believe it or not, The Rules of the Game was booed at its premiere in 1939. In fact, a few months after its release, it was banned by authorities on account of its depressing, morbid, immoral influence over the young. Perhaps that's not surprising when you consider the pre-war climate it was made in. At the time, the world knew what was ahead, and here we had a story of the upper classes living the high life. It's actually a social satire that points a spotlight on inequality, a theme that's still very popular among filmmakers like Bong Joon-ho. But it wasn't until the film resurfaced in the 1950s that it was hailed as a masterpiece. From a technical standpoint, there is much to admire here, from the use of deep focus, allowing the audience to see layers of action play out, to the camera movements that keep the energy of the complex narrative high. I've often thought of Raging Bull as America's version of This Sporting Life, which was a British kitchen sink drama that showed the ugly side of sport. There are lots of similarities between the two. The central theme of masculinity, self-alienation and loathing within the lead characters, ultimately leading to a spiral of self-destruction and violence. Even the realist cinematic style, with both films being shot in black and white. But where Raging Bull deviates is in Scorsese's stylized depiction of violence, utilizing slow motion, extreme close-ups, and point-of-view shots that make De Niro's character's psychological suffering the main focus. It's a testament to the filmmaking that we feel sympathy for the character, despite some of his behaviours throughout. It's a powerhouse film that even now will knock you for six. And there we are at 60. I've loved reading your comments in the last video, even those that point out why the list is flawed or void because it doesn't feature such and such a film. It's made for some excellent debate, and I'm hoping this installment will spark as much conversation. So please do join me down in the comments and tell me what you think of the films that were in the list and those that weren't. Or to join a community of film fans and watch videos like these early, don't forget to stop by at my Patreon page. As always, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.